School desegregation cases, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, and Bowling versus Sharp, 1954.
Less than 3 decades after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court held in Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, that the government could segregate public accommodations, such as railroads, so long as the separate facilities were, quote, equal. Over the next 5 decades, the rule in Plessy institutionalized racial segregation throughout the country. That tide, however, would begin to turn in the 1930s, when a constitutional attack on the separate but equal doctrine was mounted by the NAACP, which hoped to raise the cost of segregation by challenging whether schooling offered to the African Americans were truly equal, and thereby forcing Southern states to spend more money on blacks-only schools. In a string of victories, the Supreme Court found that the government was not in fact providing separate but equal education as Plessy had required. Eventually, the NAACP decided the time was right to directly confront the doctrine of separate but equal itself. In Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, the NAACP challenged segregated schools in Kansas, South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. The case was initially argued in December 1952, but the justices did not reach a decision. The case was rescheduled for re-argument the following year. The decision to have the case re-argued likely changed its fate. Chief Justice Vinson died on September 8, 1953. President Eisenhower filled that vacancy with Earl Warren, the Republican governor of California. With his political leadership experience, Warren was able to cajole his colleagues to reach a unanimous, though narrow, decision. First, the court found that the historical evidence was, quote, inconclusive with respect to whether those who wrote or ratified the 14th Amendment expected it would make segregated schools unconstitutional. Quote, "We cannot turn the clock back to 1868 when the amendment was adopted," Chief Justice Warren explained, or even to 1896 when Plessy was written. End quote. With history providing no clear answer, the court instead evaluated public education in the light of its full development and its present place in American life. Second, the court stressed that education is the very foundation of good citizenship, and relying on social science research rather than case law, it noted that, quote, "It is doubtful that any child may reasonably be expected to succeed in life if he is denied the opportunity of an education," end quote. From this, the justices concluded that, quote, "segregation of children in public schools solely on the basis of race deprives the children of the minority group of equal educational opportunities," end quote. Study guide. What role should social science play in the development of constitutional law? Third, the court stopped short of overruling Plessy v. Ferguson. Rather, the court finds that Plessy was inconsistent with findings of social science that, quote, "segregation of white and colored children in public schools has a detrimental effect on the colored children." In short, when it comes to education, separate is inherently unequal and therefore violative of the 14th Amendment. Study guide. After Brown, is segregation unconstitutional in all government institutions?
Brown concerned whether racially segregated state schools violated the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment, however, is commonly understood only to restrict the state's police power, not the federal government's powers. The Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause, however, does limit federal power. It provides that, quote, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." At the time Brown was decided, federal law in the District of Columbia required the racial segregation of public schools. In Bowling versus Sharp, decided the same day as Brown, the court found that federal school segregation laws violated the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause.
Finally, the court did not order that all schools nationwide must desegregate immediately. Instead, the court ordered re-arguments on how to implement the decision. 1 year later, in a case known as Brown v. Board of Education 2, 1955, The justices instructed the lower courts to ensure that public schools are integrated with, quote, all deliberate speed, end quote. Alas, that decree would not be heeded as school districts throughout the South, as part of the, quote, massive resistance, tenaciously fought against integration. Over the next 4 decades, the courts will closely monitor that process.